time since the beginning of the war, the President of the United States goes to a baseball game. Harry S. Truman takes his place in the stands, autographing a baseball for the Washington mascot before the game between teams representing Washington and St. Louis. The President tosses out the first ball to start the game. The St. Louis team takes to the field. Baseball Commissioner Chandler is among the spectators, as in the first inning, Washington's Myatt hits safely, advancing Case to second base. Travis at bat, facing the St. Louis pitcher. Travis is out at first, but Case comes around to score. For the Washington team, a 4-1 victory. For President and Mrs. Truman, a long-postponed moment of recreation.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Tim Hanlon, and thanks for coming in. It's Good Seats Still Available. It's our curious little podcast, a journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. And we are going back in time to Washington, D.C. baseball yet again. And our previous episode with Fred Frommer was a very good survey into a very deep and rich history of baseball in Washington. But we're going to kind of circle around a particular zone, particular period of time in baseball history in D.C. In particular, the time around World War II, roughly 1941 to 1945, but obviously a couple of years prior and after. We'll get into with our guests this week, David Hubler and Josh Drazen. The authors of The Nats and the Grays, How Baseball in the Nation's Capital Survived World War II and Changed the Game Forever. The idea, the overlap, and we talked about it with Fred in our previous conversation, between baseball and Washington, D.C., right, is the nation's capital and the national pastime. And there's lots of imagery and overlap between those two ideals in the history of the sport and of our country. And it's probably most acute during the years of World War II, as baseball, essentially is held up as this, a quintessential element of American life, especially that being challenged by global powers all across the planet on, what is arguably a very scary and uncertain time in not only our nation's history, but the world's history, about sort of the balance of freedoms and the way of life, I guess, that America presumes to hold up and its ideals, and baseball, the quintessential example of such. The idea, frankly, of baseball, not only as perhaps as a soothing salve, shall we say, for a war-weary nation that is distracted and on edge and worried about its future and the people fighting the battles to preserve that future. Baseball is a nice sort of distraction, I guess, from those challenges. But, obviously there's another, group of folk who think that, the idea of playing pro baseball is a bit frivolous when the nation is, gearing for battle and rationing and all these kinds of things to sort of sacrifice for the future and hopefully to win and persevere against the forces of evil, shall we say, in Europe and Asia. But this it's a fascinating discussion that we get into with Messrs. Hubler and Drazen in a few minutes in this conversation. And you had not one, actually, the Washington Senators, but two, the Homestead Grays of the then Negro National League, that were really Washington, D.C.'s pro baseball teams during this period of time. And very interesting stories, and very different ones at that, around the two teams that essentially kept the baseball going in Washington, D.C. during these very challenging and difficult and troubled times during World War II. A very rich and amazing set of anecdotes and stories and little factoids that we're going to unearth in our conversation coming up in a couple of seconds with David Hubler and Josh Drazen as we talk about the Washington Nationals, a.k.a. also the Washington Senators, and the Homestead Grays of the Negro National League, who played a whole bunch of their games in Washington, D.C., and we're going to get into all of that and a little bit of a circling around how baseball and Washington handled and dealt with and survived the war years of World War II in our conversation coming up in just a couple of seconds. We want to say thank you to a number of our sponsors who, despite all evidence otherwise, continue to step up and say, yeah, we'll sponsor this little show. And we'll continue our alliance with our pal Tim and Good Seats still available, and we cannot thank them enough, of course. And if you would like to show some love for the show, by all means, give them a try and check them out, and hopefully make a purchase or two, and you'll help our little show keep its lights on and our little efforts to keep going and pumping out great shows for you each and every week. Let's see, sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use the promo code GoodSeats there for 15% off all of your purchases when you're looking for great memorabilia, highly and well curated at that. And that's buttons and pennants and stickers and media guides and all kinds of very interesting stuff from all kinds of teams and leagues no longer with us. That's sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code GoodSeats for 15% off all of your purchases there. Make sure you go to oldschoolshirts.com for great logo wear, great teams and leagues, but also amusement parks and shopping malls and radio stations of yore, and some very, very cool sort of throwbacks there. By all means, check them out, oldschoolshirts.com, and make sure you use the promo code there, Good Seats, for 10% off all of your purchases there. We thank P.F. Wilson and friends in Cincinnati for that. 503 Sports, they fancy themselves as the king of throwbacks. That's 503-sports.com. Got a promo code for you there. And that's Seats, S-E-A-T-S, Seats, for 10% off all of your purchases at 503 Sports, 503-sports.com. All kinds of great shirts, but also jerseys, especially in and around football and hockey. You're going to find a whole bunch of retro jerseys from football leagues in particular, no longer with us, like the WFL and the XFL and the World League of American Football. Fun stuff there. It's 503-sports.com, promo code SEATS for 10% off all your purchases there. And last but certainly not least, our friends at streakersports.com. Streakersports.com, we got a promo code for you there. That's Good Seats, and you get 10% off all of your purchases there, and you're going to find a whole raft of shirts and logos and fun stuff there at streakersports.com. And again, promo code there is Good Seats for 10% off all your purchases. So we thank all of our great sponsors, and hopefully some more to come, and hopefully some good promotional items to come in the weeks and months ahead. And again, without their support, we can't do this silly little show. And what better way to show your support for the show than by going to their sites and making a purchase or two. Thank you so much for doing so. And thank you also for listening. Coming up for our conversation with David Hubler and Josh Drazen, they the authors of The Nats and the Grays, How Baseball in the Nation's Capital Survived World War II and Changed the Game Forever. Fascinating stuff about pro baseball, both in the American League and the Negro National League in Washington, D.C. during the World War II years. Here's our conversation that we just had a couple of weeks ago. Why don't you introduce yourselves to the audience and tell us who each of you are, and then I'm really interested in how you stumbled into this story. What was the thing that got you both interested in this particular zone of Washington, D.C. baseball, which I think is fascinating, as we'll get into.
Yes, it is. Well, I came up with this idea to write a novel about a minor league ball player who makes it to the majors for 1 year during the war. And as you know, a number of players did play like 1 year, 2 years, and then they just disappeared because the major leaguers came back from the war. And it always intrigued me how, somebody could play 1 year in the majors and then go back to the farm or the mine or whatever it might be and just have that one great memory of having actually made it to the major leagues. One of my examples for the story was Al Gianfrido, who made that wonderful catch off Joe DiMaggio in the World Series, I think 47. And most people who have any interest in the history of baseball recognize that incident because it was filmed, and it was the only time DiMaggio ever showed any emotion when he rounded second base, and Gianfrido caught the ball, and DiMaggio kicked the dirt and headed back to the dugout. And Gianfrido never played in the major leagues after that game. Most people don't know that. That was it. That was his major league career. It ended on a very high note. So I use that as a jumping off point, and I chose 1944 as the year that I would set this novel. And what I did was I created a fictional character who was a third-string catcher on the 44 Washington Senators / Nationals. I'll mention that later. I'll tell you. But what? So in 40, I chose 44 because it was the last full year of the war, and the major league the real major league players were beginning to filter back to their teams. And I had the use of the Washington Post and all the local newspapers. And since I live just outside Washington, I chose Washington. And for another special reason, the fictional character is a third-string catcher, as I said, but he has a physical disability. He has a limp. But that didn't stop some of these plays in wartime to make the major leagues. Bert Shepard, for example, played one game for Washington in the major leagues with one leg. So a bum leg would not hamper a catcher too much. Plus, the 44 Washington club was unique in the fact that it had 5 starting knuckleball pitchers. So that's usually the nightmare for a catcher is to catch one knuckleball pitcher, but the team actually had 5, I think it was 3 starters, 4 starters, and a reliever. So that made it easy for me to write something that made sense. Anyway, skipping ahead, I wrote the story. I used actual quotations from the newspapers and the flow of the season and what happened during the season, and I found it fascinating. But I was unable to find an agent to sell the book for me. And I finally went to a local publisher here in the D.C. area in Lanham, Maryland, and I pitched it to her, and she said, it's really terrific, and it's well written, but we don't do fiction. Would you consider expanding it to include all the war years, and then we could publish it as a history of wartime baseball? And my full-time position had just been eliminated, so I really had the time to do it, and that's what I did. And that's when I decided I needed some help on researching and all the other thing, and that's where Josh came in.
Yeah, and I've known David basically my whole life. David was my father's camp counselor up here in Connecticut. So I have a background in history, a major in history in undergrad. I had a journalism background. So David had said, would you join me in doing this? And I always wanted to have a book published. And so I said, absolutely. And as David said, I did a lot of the background history research and some of the editing and also obviously some of the baseball research. And I'm a huge baseball fan myself, not as big as David. I think he's the biggest baseball fan I know. But we're both huge Yankees fans. And I remember as a kid going to Yankee Stadium, he would show us kind of the back routes to get to the stadium because he grew up in the Bronx. And so I did a lot of the background World War II research, and having had both my grandfathers served in the war, World War II has basically been probably my favorite period of history to look into and take classes on. And as a result, I jumped on board, really looking forward to it because having loved both baseball and the World War II era, it just was in my wheelhouse for that kind of research and writing.
So I think it's really interesting that we had a previous conversation a couple of weeks back with Fred Frommer, who we kind of did sort of our initial, I guess, survey of Washington, D.C. baseball across all of its surprisingly lengthy and deep history. Is it ironic that you kind of started as sort of a novelization of a fictional player in and around the Washington Nationals or Senators, or was this because we obviously talked about damn Yankees and it almost seems like this team. I'm wondering if this is just a coincidence or there's just something full of lore around, I guess, sort of at least the Major League, American League, Washington Senators over that period of time that I don't want to call necessarily lamentable, but certainly was. It certainly became a muse, it seems, for more than one entity in the arts.
Yes, and the team itself it has a fascinating background, and of course, unfortunately, they've been linked with failure for so long. But during the war, they finished second and lost in 1943. They finished second. 44, they finished last. In 45, they finished second again, and they were just beaten out on the last day of the season. So they weren't all that bad. They became really bad when Bob Short owned the team, but that was only for a few years because in '61 they moved to Minnesota. So, but the team itself has had a storied background. A longtime owner, Clark Griffith, not only bought and owned the team, he's the only man in the history of baseball to have played for 20 years, managed for 20 years, and owned the team for 20 years. A team, the Washington. Actually, he managed the original New York Yankees as the Highlanders. So his background was terrific. A very incredible person. Often referred to mistakenly as a racist. So there was a lot of history there. And as I said, when I started to write the novel, being here locally, it was just a natural fit to use the resources of the Martin Luther King Library and other areas where they had all the newspapers. And, of course, I couldn't forget the Library of Congress, which is just probably the greatest gift Thomas Jefferson gave to the United States after the Declaration of Independence.
Well, let's talk about this sort of the zone of our focus here, right? Because Washington, D.C., obviously, as we've talked about before, right, is obviously a national symbol, right? It's the national pastime, right? So the overlap of those two themes is especially strong, and the visuals that historically came out of that, almost simpatico with each other, but probably no more pronounced and more more vivid, I guess, than during a time of national crisis, that being World War II. Why don't we set the table a little bit as to sort of the, and it's very much parallels sort of how you've laid out the book, but sort of the pre sort of war kind of era. Obviously, the Washington Senators, a big part of that, and obviously very interested to know sort of how these Homestead Grays of the Negro National League came into play, given the fact that they were actually not located in Washington, D.C. as well. So have a little background about sort of the 1938-39-ish or early 1940-ish kind of sort of scene set as then the war essentially becomes real and vivid and official, so to speak, as we get into to the latter part of 1941 in Washington. Well,
I wanted to add just one thing about the lore of Washington, D.C., especially during this period of time, and it probably sort of leads into your question. The reason I think this team also kind of holds a bit in the lore, not only were they pretty bad a lot of the time, but it's the fact that D.C. obviously was our nation's capital, but also Clark Griffith had a pretty good relationship, a very good relationship with President Roosevelt. And as David will probably get into in the answer to this particular question coming up, a big reason why baseball is played throughout the war has to do with Clark Griffith and the so-called green light letter. So I think, people need to realize that, not only does it have a lot of lore, but it also is, as a result of it being in the nation's capital, that the team itself and the owner played a huge role in baseball history and it continuing through the war and having all these players that had, a couple of game careers or half a year career or that kind of thing. So I just wanted to add that on top of, what made Washington so interesting for that period of time.
Actually, why don't we jump off of that? Let's talk about Griffith, right? Because, he's obviously a very a towering figure in the certainly the earliest of days, well, not earliest days, but of this franchise as it gained its toehold in the American League, especially as well as the stadium and all that kind of stuff. So explain to the audience a bit about sort of his role in keeping baseball strong in Washington and these sort of overlapping, I guess, roles that he had sort of, I guess, with his relationships with various folks in Washington, D.C. power. Yeah,
well, he first met FDR in 1917. There's a classic photo of Griffith and Roosevelt at the flagpole out in center field raising the flag on opening day. It's one of the few photos where you actually see Roosevelt standing because it was before he came down with infantile paralysis. So the two of them became friends, and at the time, Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. When this was just as the U.S. was entering World War I, and Griffith was very prominent in supporting the troops. He supplied bats and balls and gloves to the camps for the GIs, the doughboys as they were called, to play ball during the war. When World War II broke out, and I think this is one of the more fascinating aspects of the whole scene, and Josh made reference to the green light letter. On December 7th, 1941, the Major League owners, the 16 owners of the teams, were meeting in Chicago for their annual owners meeting. And there's a wonderful excerpt that I gleaned from Sports Illustrated and from a firsthand interview of how Washington learned about the attack, and many of the fans in the stands. It was the last game of the football season, and the Redskins were playing the Philadelphia Eagles in a meaningless game. Both teams were poor teams that year, and on the field, the ball players were just beginning to play, and they began hearing these announcements from the stand, from the PA system. Will so-and-so report, all soldiers report, and nobody knew what was going on. But what had happened was the owner of the Washington Redskins did not want to. He claims he didn't want to frighten the attendance in the stadium, but the real reason is he probably wanted to keep them there so they'd buy more food and drinks at the concessions. So the owners at the same time were in Chicago, beginning their annual meetings, and the war broke out. Well, the first question was, among the owners, what should we do? Are we going to play? It was a big question during World War I as well, and the answer in World War I is no. Keep the game going. It was good for morale. But of course, in 1917, 1918, the only way fans of the game could learn about what was going on without visiting the stadiums, and there weren't that many teams, of course. The only way they could learn about it was from the newspapers. So it wasn't like even the days of radio when you could just turn on the radio and listen to a baseball game. So by 41, the same situation pertained. What are we going to do about Major League Baseball? Well, a few days after the war was declared, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the baseball commissioner, who hated Roosevelt, just despised the man. He was a Midwestern, arch-conservative Republican, and he had no use for Roosevelt. Roosevelt, on the other hand, had very little use for Landis. Landis sent him a letter saying, well, now what should we do? The letter was gratuitous in its attempt to, say, well, Mr. President, what should we do? My thinking is that he sent a letter to Roosevelt hoping that Roosevelt would shut down the game and take the blame for not having baseball. But Roosevelt sent back a letter which, to my way of thinking and the research I did, it's pretty clear that Roosevelt didn't really write the letter himself. I mean, the man is now starting World War II, and he probably doesn't have time for that sort of thing. I believe, based on what's in the letter, that Roosevelt actually said to FDR, here, please answer this letter and we'll send it off. So Griffith saw an opportunity to keep the game going and to add night games. One of Griffith's plans was to expand baseball to night games. Washington was one of the first teams to have lights for night games because there was money to be made at night. Cincinnati had had the first night game in '35, I think it was. And with the coming of more and more troops and government workers into Washington, night games would really be a one way to build morale. So he wrote this letter, I believe, which Roosevelt then sent on to Landis, and it's called the Green Light Letter. There's a big photocopy blow-up of it in the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And Roosevelt said, no, we'll continue the game. It's good for morale. And by the way, why don't you consider increasing the number of night games? Now, Roosevelt probably had no interest or knowledge about the night games. He was a big baseball fan, but I'm sure, he remembers them all being played under the sun. So I think that's one of the key clues to my supposition that the letter was penned by Rick Griffith and signed by Roosevelt.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Josh, maybe you want to weigh in here. So, Griffith, right? And I don't think it's known to a lot of. Well, maybe it is known because obviously he's a Hall of Famer. Griffith's a baseball guy, right? He played. He had a fairly well-off career on the field and managing, and he essentially parlayed that into essentially running the Senators franchise, albeit relatively tight-fisted from all accounts.
Correct.
But wow, I mean, what an influence that he has with some of the highest holders of office in the land behind the scenes around baseball.
Yeah, it even goes high more than that. But Josh,
I was just going to say, I think that his being in D.C. again, it goes back to the whole being in D.C. and being close to this, to the seat of power. He, had access to these people that other owners, probably didn't have quite nearly as much of, especially back in the day when travel wasn't what it is now. And also, the night games were another reason they had the night games was to they had numerous shifts of people working, whether it was in defense or in other areas of D.C., and also the factory workers, and they wanted to be able to have people to come at night. But yeah, Griffith also, the other thing about him was that he, unlike the Crossley brothers or Wrigley or any of the other people who derived a lot of their income from other sources, Griffith's own, main source of income was his team. So he was not only very tight-fisted with things, but he depended upon his team for his main source of income. And as a result, I think you would ask about the Grays. How did they end up in D.C. when they're the Homestead Grays? Homestead's a small, I guess, a town outside of Pittsburgh. They played roughly 2/3 of their home games for many years in D.C. and rented from Griffith, and he saw an opportunity to make more money to rent to the Homestead Grays. So they played in Washington most of their home games, and he made a good amount of money off of that as well.
Are you saying that the and we'll get more into the Grays in a few minutes, but you're saying that the Grays' appearance in D.C. was more of a financially driven decision by Griffith to kind of fill in some spots in the stadium than anything?
A good portion of it was that he saw an opportunity to make money. The Grays also did too. There was a large African American population in D.C., and so obviously there was interest there. But yeah, he needed to make money from every part of his baseball ownership. And in fact, early on in the team's history, we get into it in the book about how he gets ownership of the Nationals, because he starts out, buying minority portions of it. Then he had a partner. Then I believe the partner, he started to buy more and more out. David may be able to get into some of that if you'd like to, but basically that was his main source. So as a result of that, any source of income that he could come across, he would grab. And obviously having the Grays play in the stadium, renting to them, and then on top of it having more night games where he could make more money, were two ways, that he saw a way to continue to, line his pockets as that was his. He didn't have chewing gum like the Wrigleys or the car radio type, I believe it was the car radios and other types of auto types of things that the Crossley brothers were in. So he basically needed that source of income for, to pay his players and also to, run the team.
Yeah, and the theory there, and you mentioned it, Tim, that he was tight with a buck. He was, but it was strictly because that baseball was his only source of income. Not even Maine. It was the stadium and the team. In fact, in doing the research for the novel, which goes way back. I started this thing with a glint in my eye in the 1980s, late 80s, and a number of the players who were on that 44 team were still alive, and I fortunately recorded my interviews with them so I could use some of it, not knowing, of course, but I did use some of it in the Nats and the Grays.
Oh, absolutely.
But to a man, they loved Clark Griffith. They recognized his his financial situation and that he was tight. But for example, in one case, a rookie, and the rookie, I forget which one it was. One of the pitchers told me that he came onto the team as a rookie, and he wanted to know where he could find decent housing, because he was only making maybe $2,000 for the summer. The pay was meager. So Griffith said, "Oh, just you go into a hotel and we'll pay the bill. Just don't worry about that for now." That was one example. George Case III, who is the son of George Case Jr., the major league player who played for Washington for a number of years, and he was a fine center fielder for the team. In fact, he won the stolen base title in the American League for about 5 years, very fast. He told me that his dad went into Clark Griffith's one time, and he said, "Look, please, I really need a bit more money. You got to raise my salary." So Griffith said, "Okay, I'll give you a $500 bonus." He said, "But at the end of the year, if we don't make money, I'm going to ask you to give it back." The $500. So I mean, that's the kind of situation Griffith had. He did rent out the stadium. He rented the stadium out for to the Redskins as well. But aside from that, he was very, very generous in organizing fund drives for the GIs to raise money for the Army and the Navy welfare organizations. They had special events at Griffith Stadium, dollar nights, where everybody had to pay, including the ball players, and the money went to these funds. So he was very good with money, but who didn't have, as Josh said, and it was true, he did not have the outside income that would have allowed him to sort of use the team as his pastime. It was his business.
Yeah, in fact, David mentioned some of the players and how much they loved him. Clark Griffith was known as the Old Fox, and I believe he often referred to his players, they would themselves as a bunch of kids. So it was almost like they were his children in a way, how he took care of them. But as David said, they were not, back then obviously paid very well compared to baseball players. Now you would never think of them needing to, number one, you wouldn't hear about them giving bonuses back. But on top of that, you wouldn't think of them needing to worry about money for a hotel or something of that nature, or food, things of that nature. But he was, they did absolutely respect and love him as an owner.
How does the dynamic of the Senators and running Griffith Stadium and having the Grays in there as well, how does that dynamic, if at all, that we've just established change, given now that the war is full on the field, off the field? How dramatic are the changes, I guess, in the way that Griffith approaches not only his team but the running of his enterprise, and maybe as a tableau against sort of baseball generally as the war looms?
Yeah, there were a couple of major shifts, major changes during the war. One of them being that the war, which board? I forget the War Mobilization Board, I believe it was called, determined that for one reason or other, what they were trying to do was save space on the railroads. The teams traveled by railroad in those days. So they banned the teams from going to Florida and California for spring training. They had to stay within a reasonable distance from their home stadium. Well, of course, right now there's snow on the ground here in Washington, and there'll probably be some snow come later in February when the teams come out to practice. So it's not the best venue for playing. But what happened was, and again, this shows the generosity of Clark Griffith. When he was providing the troops, the doughboys with equipment, he also befriended President Byrd of the young University of Maryland. He gave him equipment for his little baseball team, college baseball team, and Byrd never forgot that. So when the teams were forced to practice to have spring training near their own stadium, he offered the University of Maryland facilities to Griffith. So Griffith's teams for 3 years did not go down to Florida. They played, they used to, Tinker Field in Orlando was where they had their routine spring training. So they couldn't go down there. So they practiced and had the health spring training very often indoors.
At the Ritchie Fieldhouse, I think, right, David, in Maryland?
The what?
I think it was called the Ritchie Fieldhouse or something like that.
It was
a lot of times
Cole
inside.
Fieldhouse.
Yeah, they were inside a lot.
Yeah, inside a lot. So that was one thing. And then another aspect of this, the wartime, was that because there were so many camps, Army camps and Navy facilities in and around the D.C. area, and most of them had a baseball team. And so Griffith was able to take his team and practice with real games. The teams are pretty good. So that was one aspect of how Griffith was able to use what was available at the time. For the Negro Leagues, when those restrictions went in, that was a real tough road to hoe, because the Negro League teams, if you look at the history of it, and probably the best history of the Negro League teams was called Beyond the Shadow of the Senators by Brad Snyder, and it's a wonderful history of the formation of the leagues and everything. Before the war in the 30s, as these teams were being formed, folding, there were a whole bunch of these Negro League teams come out, and I'm lumping them all as Negro League. They weren't all in the two main Negro Leagues that we think about. But they barnstormed across the South and the Midwest, and that's where they picked up extra money. On Sunday, Saturday and Sunday, they would play in Griffith Stadium. They played in Yankee Stadium when the Yankees, of course, were out of town. And that's where those were the official games. So the money that came came to the Negro Leagues was primarily from the barnstorming. But with the restrictions on they were popularly known as the gasoline restrictions, but the restrictions actually were to save rubber. It wasn't because they weren't short of gasoline. That's another misnomer or misunderstanding that baseball fans and other fans have, that during the war, well, they instituted restrictions on gasoline. Well, they did, but the gasoline restrictions were because that was the only measurable commodity that they could measure when it came to how do you measure the amount of time a car was driven and the rubber on the tires. You can, but you if you limit the amount of gasoline that goes into the car, that also limits the amount of time the tires can be worn. So they limited that, and that really hurt the Negro Leagues because it meant that they're barnstorming by these rickety old buses, and they're shown in some of the films. I think 41, there's a scene of that on the bus. They're almost like old school buses. So during the war, they lost a lot of money on that, but they made a lot of money because only a few of the stars actually went into the war. So that was one thing that the teams did very well. Their annual East-West All-Star game, which was played in your neck of the woods, Tim, in Wrigley Field, or the Comiskey. It was played at Comiskey. They would average about 35,000 fans for this big game. It actually outdrew the Major League All-Star game on occasion. And one year, there wasn't even an All-Star game.
So there was an attraction then maybe to domicile teams then instead of having them on the road. So maybe having the Homestead Grays having sort of a second home at Griffith Stadium became more of an attractive business proposition?
Absolutely, because as Josh said, Washington's large black population was just ripe for this, and plus the Negro League teams loved to come into Washington because they were treated well. Griffith, by the way, did not have a segregated section of Griffith Stadium set aside for African Americans. There was a section where they sat, but it wasn't like they couldn't sit anywhere else. They just sort of gravitated to this left field area there off the third baseline. There was never any formal restrictions at Griffith Stadium about, whites only, coloreds only, that sort of thing. So that was another thing that the black community in D.C. sort of enjoyed. Plus, the teams had they had black restaurants, they had black nightclubs in town. They had all the amenities it was a major city, which they didn't find in Homestead or even in Pittsburgh or some of the other cities in the circuit. So that was one of the main reasons. And Griffith Griffith took a lot of pressure on his shoulders because he was not ready to bring an African-American ball player to the team. And it wasn't because of segregation. It was because he knew, being such an astute baseball man and finance man, that it would kill the Negro Leagues, which it did.
And he would lose the rent. Yeah, he'd lose the rent to the stadium,
sure.
As David was saying. And also the other thing that we didn't mention is the Homestead Grays, unlike the Nationals, were a superpower team. I mean, they were amazing. They had Josh Gibson, they had Cool Papa Bell. They won, I believe it was 9 Negro National League titles in a row. They won, I think, 2 or 3 World Series during that period of time. So they were kind of the polar opposite of the Nationals being, last place or that type of thing. So they I just figured we probably should mention how good they were, and they have numerous players that are in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, I would argue that saying that they were good is probably
they were great. They were superpower. Yeah.
So Josh, maybe we can use that as I'm curious as to sort of how the Grays came to D.C. versus say going to another city. So did you guys get into sort of the dynamics of how Griffith and the Grays sort of came to an agreement and why D.C. became their home away from home versus, say, other locations?
Well, Sam Lacey, who was one of the top black sports writers in the country, his columns were syndicated in the African American newspapers in Baltimore and Washington and elsewhere. He was instrumental in bringing the team to play in Washington, and he fought for. He wanted to bring about integration of as did all of the black sports writers at the time. But Lacey, in particular, was the loud voice, the sort of the Howard Cosell of sports casters, so he convinced Gus Greenlee was the owner of the Grays, and convinced Greenlee to bring the team. Greenlee was always looking to make money. One of the things about the Negro League teams is that they were so terribly disorganized. In fact, it was Sam Lacey. I believe I was at they did a presentation for Arthur Ashe shortly before he died, and it was covered in D.C., and I went to cover it, and I think it was Sam Lacey who was still alive. He lived to be quite an old man, and he was talking about how hard it was to actually, given the totals of games, because so many of the games were not official. How do you count how many home runs someone hit in the Negro leagues? Or how many wins?
Satchel Paige or
Satchel
somebody.
Paige. Yeah, how many wins they had because they pitched on the road during the barnstorming. Then they pitched in Yankee Stadium. They went from some dirt field in Kentucky, let's say, to pitching in Yankee Stadium. Well, how do you keep track of this? Because you could keep track of it if you followed the African American newspapers, but even they were unable to. They didn't have an assigned beat writer with these teams. If you look at some of the black papers, you'll find some games are covered, and then they jump to other games. So it was very difficult for them to actually be considered. In fact, that was one of the excuses that Major League Baseball gave for not integrating at least one or two of the teams. There was an idea of, we'll bring in the Kansas City Monarchs, which was the other main major league. It was like the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. Those two teams dominated the East and the West leagues, but they never did. And the easiest reason, Major League Baseball game, well, you're too disorganized. We can't have this disorganization in Major League Baseball.
And I will say also, in terms of research, that what David said, it rings very true in terms of trying to find stats for the Negro League games and years and careers. They're just very, very sporadic, and it's for the reasons that David said, because they barnstormed, they played in different places, and they weren't covered. They didn't have beat reporters on them, so it was very difficult to find any kind of real accurate stats on a lot of these guys for the Grays.
Yeah, for example, Josh Gibson. There's been a recurring story for many, many years that Josh Gibson is the only ball player ever to hit a home run fair out of Yankee Stadium, the old Yankee Stadium, of course, we're talking about. There's no record of it. Now, if they couldn't find a record of that in New York, well, granted, the Negro Leagues were not covered as deeply as the American and National League were, but there's no record of it. Yet the story persists that he did that.
So what I'm really curious though is given Homestead and being sort of domiciled in Western Pennsylvania, why not Cleveland? Why not Pittsburgh? Why not Philadelphia? Why not some other urban area that also had some substantial African American population that would sustain a franchise? Why Washington, D.C., based on what you could tell?
That's a good question. As I said, I think it's because a lot of those cities, for example, Kansas City and St. Louis were very, very segregated cities. St. Louis in particular. The Nationals / Senators had lots of fights with the St. Louis Browns because their players were so bigoted, and the team and the city was very much segregated. Washington, Greenlee, and Lacey were instrumental in bringing the team. They still were the Homestead Grays, but more and more they played in D.C. And because of the facilities there, Washington probably had the largest black population of any major city at the time. That was a population that was pretty much free to move around. There were restrictions on the trolleys. I remember that as a little kid going onto a trolley in D.C. and seeing the section coloreds only in the back of the thing. Coming from New York, that was really quite a shock to see that in person. But for the most part, they also had we've talked about them being a large population in this. There were also a prosperous percentage of black families. They had jobs. They had government jobs. They had other jobs. They weren't all housekeepers or day laborers. There was a large middle class that I'm sure was very attractive to Greenlee and the other black financiers and bankers in D.C.
All right, we're going to take a quick, brief pause, and we want to remind you that our friends at Audible are offering to you, our listeners, an opportunity to get a free audiobook download from their amazing array of over 190,000 titles to choose from. When you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, and that's the place to go to get your free audiobook download, courtesy of us and Audible. And it's something you can cancel at any time, and you can keep the book for as long as your device exists. And like I said before, there's just a ton of choices available to you to burn up that free credit, including a bunch in the realm of our forgotten sports little genre here, including in the realm of basketball. If you fancy yourself a fan of the old ABA, for example, two great books on the great Julius Erving that might be worth using your credit for. One, of course, is the Rise and Rise of Julius Erving. It's called Doc, and it's written by Vincent Milazzi and narrated by David Cromet. You could use your credit for that book, and it's a great sort of interview style background on the life and times of Dr. J from all sides. But if that's not good enough for you, why not try the autobiography? It's called Dr. J, the Autobiography, of course. It's written by Dr. J in concert with Carl Greenfeld. And it's narrated by Dr. J himself, Julius Erving. And you could use your credit for that book, as well as, like I said, thousands and thousands of other books, not just only in basketball and basketball history, but in a whole host of genres and topics. By all means, give them a try. Why don't you? It's risk-free, for God's sakes. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Yes, audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the link. And that's where you're going to get your free audiobook download. Again, you can cancel at any time. And once you do download that book for free, and after you cancel it, if you choose to do that, it's yours to keep. So you can enjoy in perpetuity, for as long as your device lives, the downloaded book free and gratis, courtesy of yours truly here at Good Seats Still Available and our friends at Audible. Thank you, Audible. We appreciate it. And we appreciate you joining our conversation once again. So let's talk about sort of the war and baseball, right? Because you're mentioning before that the Negro Leagues didn't seem to be injured too much in terms of their loss of talent by the draft and the ramping up of the machinery needed to fight the war. But clearly, Major League Baseball was hit very hard in terms of quality players being drafted and going off to more serious pursuits versus playing baseball. So, how did that give the audience a sense of how baseball sort of changed? I mean, the Senators were not all that great going into the war. Let's be honest.
No, of course.
Any substantial difference to the Senators, and just generally, how does baseball, sort of limp along, I guess, or if it did limp along during this period of time in D.C.?
No, it didn't limp along, especially in D.C. because Griffith, as I said, he had ladies' nights. He each year when the owners got together, he would push for more night games. Night games were his real bread and butter. With all the people in the service working days, the night games. In fact, he actually was the creator of the old twilight doubleheader. The first game would start about 4:00. Now, keep in mind that those games would last like an hour and 50 minutes. 2 hours was a long game because they didn't have interruptions for TV commercials. So they could play. They could start a doubleheader, and Griffith Stadium had lights. They could start a doubleheader at 4:30 in the afternoon, and many people could get off work, an hour early, or maybe come in the second or third inning of the first game. So each year, Griffith added more of these night games and twilight doubleheaders. And of course, in those days, that was all single admission. You didn't have what they have now, where you have to leave the stadium and then come back for the second game if you have tickets for both games. So he did very well on that score during the war. And of course, he rented the stadium to the Redskins. In fact, one year, I think it was 45. In 45, he rented the stadium to the Redskins, and the Redskins had the last two games were at the stadium, and to complete the Major League Baseball season, they had to double up on double headers. So and a number of the players felt that was the reason they just missed out on winning the pennant, because arms were shot. The pitchers were pitching a double header. They something like 20 some odd double headers in
played,
a month.
28 1 year or something.
Yeah, 28 double headers. I mean, in 1 month. So.
But Josh, the player pool, though, right, was a little thin, but ironically, it helped the Senators actually.
It did.
Became more competitive over a couple of seasons.
It did. I think it's interesting you mentioned that, because it did help them. There were so many players, obviously, that were off at the war, overseas, and it definitely the Nationals were affected as badly as anybody else. But the interesting part is Griffith was very resourceful, and he would find players in different places. For example, he didn't push integration because, as David said, he knew he would lose the rent from the Grays, and they had some obviously great players that would have made a huge difference at that time, but it just didn't happen. But he did bring Cuban players up from and other players from that area, from Central America and Cuba, to play for the Nationals. And of course, there was a skin color bias, bias and racism, where these were light-skinned Cuban players. But as a result of kind of being resourceful, I think he was good at finding players that helped a little bit. And gave them a little bit of an advantage. It kind of reminded me as a kid watching the NFL strike, and I think it was in the 80s. The teams that picked the kind of players off the replacement players, the teams that were better at that and paid more attention to that, had an advantage when the real players came back because they had better records. But in his case, by getting these different players from, David mentioned Bert Shepard. He was a one-legged pitcher. They fought with the Yankees over getting him. He ended up only pitching one game. It didn't make that huge of a difference, obviously. But, these were the kinds of things that he was doing throughout the entire war. was getting players from all different sources. I mean, they had a guy named Ed Boland who was he was literally a trash man. You know, he worked for the New York Sanitation Department, and he didn't play very much. He played well when they had him, but he actually had LaGuardia give Boland. Boland didn't want to leave his job at the Sanitation Department because he was getting paid too well. And
his pension. He didn't want to.
Yeah, and a pension. So as a result,
Griffith went to
LaGuardia.
To LaGuardia.
And asked him for, could Boland have another month off to play for the Nationals? So these were the kind of things that went on, where he, was resourceful in finding these stopgap players to fill in for the guys who were gone. For guys like they were all, most of them were gone for the war period. So as a result, that did make them a little bit better and did give them a little bit of an advantage, was his resourcefulness.
He had two great players, Buddy Lewis and Cecil Travis, who went off to war. And Buddy Lewis was a pilot and flew the hump. He flew several hundred missions.
368. Yeah.
Yes, over the mountains there into Burma, and Cecil Travis was at the Battle of the Bulge and lost several toes on his foot from frostbite, and he never was the same after that. He's sometimes been called the best ball player not to have made the Hall of Fame.
So, given DC's obviously place as the nation's capital, and obviously the center of all things war information and all of that, and that of a still relatively thriving baseball sort of environment during those years, what was sort of the overlap? Was baseball, and given sort of the stage that it conveniently sort of offered politicians and whatnot, was it a salve for a war-weary and beleaguered and frankly oftentimes frightened and worried country? Or was it looked upon as frivolous and maybe something that shouldn't have been done? It seems like it's a very tenuous sort of time for baseball in Washington, D.C., given sort of the dual nature of maybe why the sport should or should not be played during those years.
Yeah, well, that was a controversy that actually lasted for pretty much during the war years. You raised a good point. There was that feeling that it was frivolous, and it wasn't just Washington; it was throughout the game. But in Washington in particular, because of the great number of service personnel and war employees, they did enjoy the games. They did go to Griffith Stadium. Their attendance figures were pretty good. A couple of years, I think they actually outdrew the Yankees in attendance in terms of the price of tickets and things like that. So it lasted for a good. In fact, there was a controversy in the papers about. The games are being played, but should they really continue? And they did a poll. They took a poll of the servicemen, and the servicemen said, "Oh yeah, we have to. We really like to hear what's going on. Keep the game going." It was an overwhelmingly popular thing to do, and of course, baseball figured somewhat in the war effort too, because they used code words. Who's the Dodgers second baseman, and the Germans who were trying to infiltrate with a good English accent.
During the Battle of the Bulge, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, they didn't know. So the GIs themselves and the sailors, of course, they all wanted the game to continue. So when that poll came out, I think that dampened anyone's feelings of let's stop this thing. And they played. There was only one year when I think it was 43 when there was no All-Star game. So everything continued as in the past. And truth be told, although the greatest ball players, the Maggios, Bob Fellas, Ted Williams,
Greenberg,
Hank Greenberg especially, they were lost for the duration of the war, but a couple like Hank Greenberg came back in 1945. A great story about Hank Greenberg. Yeah, just a second, I'll truncate it. Greenberg came back and right away resumed hitting home runs. So they were playing like the last game of the season, and it was Detroit against St. Louis. Whichever team won was going to win the pennant, and the St. Louis Browns, for some reason, the manager decided to walk the batter ahead. There was a runner on second base. The score was either tied. Yeah, it was tied. They walked. He intentionally gave a pass to the batter ahead of Hank Greenberg. So there was like, I think it actually loaded the bases.
Loaded the bases, yeah.
Yeah, loaded the bases, and they let Hank Greenberg come up and hit, and of course he hit a grand slam home run. So the Tigers won. I mean, to my mind, that's one of the worst decisions ever made by any manager. To walk the batter ahead of Hank Greenberg and let him hit. And so he was back in time before the war actually ended. And so, I mean, even though the big stars were off to the war, in many cases, the teams themselves were able to compete.
An interesting addition to what David was talking about with Hank Greenberg hitting that grand slam. Actually, David interviewed some of the Nationals, and they were, I believe, waiting at Union Station in
Yes, that's right.
Because they weren't sure whether or not they were going to win the pennant or not, and that knocked them out. And that's how. So basically, as a result of that, they were done, and they had a chance to win a pennant. When they're talking about, again, we're talking about a team really didn't have a lot of success, so this would have made a huge difference, and they lost out because of that Hank Greenberg grand slam.
Yeah, if St. Louis had won, they would have had a one-game playoff between the Browns.
That's right. And playoff. Yeah, that's correct.
I think it's also very interesting generally when you take both the and this is sort of the on-field play, right, of both the Senators and the Grays, right? In many respects, and I don't have any comparative data in front of me at my fingertips, but you had actually some very competitive teams across both of them, right? You had the Grays winning the Negro League World Series in 43 and 44, and even the Senators were competitive in 43, albeit, more than 10, 12 games behind the Yankees that season. But in 45, they were only a game and a half out of winning their division and going into the World Series themselves. So it seems like if I was a Washington, D.C. baseball fan at that time, I almost had sort of maybe a semi-embarrassment of riches given both of these clubs being relatively competitive. In the case of the Grays, championship caliber. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, the Grays were, that because they had Gibson and Cool Papa Bell and like David said, they and the Monarchs were the dynasties of the time in the Negro Leagues. So they were an embarrassment of riches for 9-10 years in a row, especially in their own league. And the Nationals, had way more success during the war years. Again, I think because of the dearth of talent in the major leagues and players being overseas from all the different teams and all the big stars. And it may have, evened it out a bit because they were able to find, little kind of trinkets of gold, so to speak, in some of these players that normally wouldn't be playing that Griffith found as a result of that.
Yeah, and Kansas City, of course, in 45 had Jackie Robinson. That was his 1 year that was his last year in the Negro Leagues. The next year was with Montreal and Brooklyn Dodger farm system. So those two teams were definitely the two best in the Negro Leagues, and Kansas City had a decent size black population as well. And then of course that. They just crumbled. By the early 50s, they were gone. The Negro Leagues were gone. Griffith was right. Integration killed them.
Yeah, let's round third base on that and sort of use this sort of as a tip off to sort of what transpired after the war ended. But before I do want to ask you one last question. Did you guys get into comparatively how each of the teams did at the box office, so to speak? I mean, did the Grays and or the Senators, were they equal in terms of their drawing power and adding to Griffith's business here, or did one kind of outdraw the other? I mean, I'm curious as to sort of the business dynamic between these two clubs, and arguably from sort of two different business bases, I guess, of fans.
Well, of course, the Nationals, the Senators, outdrew the Grays simply because the Grays only played there on the weekends when Washington was away. So Washington played many, many more games at Griffith Stadium than the Homestead Grays did. So I don't think it's a fair comparison. Both, as I said earlier, Washington did very well at the box office during the war, and the Grays did as well. But I don't think it's a fair comparison. Because of the day they played all these, Washington played all these day games during the week, and even if they drew only maybe 5,000-6,000 people, the Grays were off somewhere attempting to barnstorm, or not even when they had to ride the trains, and that really cut into their expenses to buy railroad tickets because they couldn't use the buses. So I don't think it's I don't think it would tell us very much.
But it seems like when the Grays were in town, that they still drew very well as well, though, right? Even though they had
Oh yeah, absolutely. And of course, the real draw was that East-West game played in Chicago. You couldn't get a ticket to that game.
In the book, we get into some of the numbers in terms of the gate and the box office. But as David said, the Nationals had many more games at Griffith Stadium than the Grays did. So as a result, it's a hard comparison to make in terms of who made more money and that kind of thing, because there were less Grays games at Griffith Stadium. But they both drew very well, and the attendance figures, we get into some of that in the book as well with some of the games. And during the year, as David said, the Nationals led, the league in attendance. And I think a lot of that also was because of some of the transient population that came down through D.C. during the war for the war effort, whether they were working, in the War Department or other parts of the government. There were a lot of people that, D.C. swelled as a city, grew as people came down there to, help with the war effort.
All right, so let's talk about sort of the aftermath, right? So the war ending in for good in the latter part of 45. It's interesting what happens to each of these teams and baseball in DC, and it's interesting to me that in both cases, for different reasons, the future wasn't nearly as bright, perhaps as it was during these 4 or 5 years that we've spent talking about. Do you want to sort of get into sort of the legacy of what the Senators sort of stumbled through for the decade that followed, as well as, I think you kind of hinted at it, what happened to sort of the Grays and the Negro Leagues generally, in the aftermath of all of this?
Well, I would be remiss if I really wanted to tell. This is a story that turns out it was not known just about anywhere else. In doing our research, I came across this on April 12th, 45. It was just before the seasons usually opened around the 18th or 20th of April. One of the things that Griffith did every year was he presented Roosevelt with a gold-plated pass that he could go to as many games as he wanted to. Well, of course, during the war he didn't, because he even had to stop throwing out the first ball at the opening game because of the war effort. But he would get this pass every year. And in 45, he'd also given one to his new vice president, Roosevelt's new vice president, Harry Truman, so he could go to the games. And of course, on April 12th, Truman became president when Roosevelt died down in Warm Springs, Georgia. But Truman had started out the morning as the vice president with his pass, and he must have dictated to his secretary, because I saw it on the screen on Vice President stationery, a thank you note to Clark Griffith saying thank you for this pass. I'm looking forward to it, etc. Just a sort of cursory thank you note. However, at the bottom of it, in Truman's own handwriting, which I sent to the Truman Library, and they said, yeah, that's his handwriting, was a second note saying, to the effect that, well, things have drastically changed, and I think I'm in for it now. So between the letter being written and the time Truman got to sign it, he found out that he was now the president, and he still had the presence of mind, the goodness of heart to just pen this additional note onto it. I mean, you can imagine what was, the things that were befalling him at that moment, and yet he still did it. Now, I checked all over. I even checked in David McCulloch's huge Truman volume, and there's no mention of that. It showed up in an online collector's a page of documents, signed documents that he owned. They wouldn't allow me to reproduce it in the book, although I tried. So we were able to talk about it. But just think about that. The very day that Franklin Roosevelt dies, Truman is now president, he still has time to write a thank you note to Clark Griffith. And he, too, was a big baseball fan. So that in itself helped to transition out of the war years and into baseball in the late 40s and early 50s. Truman and Eisenhower, both. Fortunately for baseball, the presidents in those days were big baseball fans.
Yeah, it seems like Truman, among many of the presidents, seemed to be quite photogenic and available for a lot of those first pitches and whatnot, maybe relative to his predecessors and folks afterwards.
Well, he was ambidextrous. So one year he would throw it out right-handed, and the next year he threw it out left-handed.
Interesting. So
yeah.
Josh, maybe you could sort of walk us through. So what give us a little bit of the two tributaries of sort of what happens with the Senators in the years that follow, as well as the Grays in the years that follow.
Well, I think the biggest thing that happens to the Grays is obviously Jackie Robinson gets signed by Branch Rickey, and that changes, as David said, it sort of changes the whole way. The Negro Leagues are sort of, after the war years, are starting to, as they integrate the Negro Leagues into the major leagues, the Negro Leagues start to see their end, and obviously they ended later in the 40s or early 50s. But basically, as they were integrating, it ended that. So the 45 signing of Jackie Robinson, of him being sent to the Montreal Royals, and then obviously breaking the color barrier in 47, and joining the Dodgers. That's one of the biggest, I guess you would say, of the tributaries of the end of the war. And there was a lot of, I think we probably got into a little bit, but there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not during the war the league should have been integrated, and obviously they weren't. But the African American press was questioning, why they weren't doing this, and there were a couple of kind of false tryouts, kind of with some of the Negro League players, where major league teams would have these kind of fake they would say they were trying out these players, but then they had absolutely no interest in signing them. They weren't going to do anything. And, and Griffith also, as David mentioned earlier, had an opportunity. He could have integrated his team with Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell and many other players who were right there on his doorstep. But he didn't, primarily, we believe, because he, needed the money from the revenue from the rent that he was getting from the Grays. But after the war, as we know, there was a push for desegregation. Truman desegregated the military, I believe, in 1947. So all these things kind of come to a head. And as a result of that, at the end of the war, that's one of the two big things that changed. The other big thing that changed was night baseball. There were many more night games after this. Matter of fact, Griffith was pushing, I believe, other teams were doing about 7 night games to 14 night games, and he would usually push to get more because he was in D.C. They weren't allowed, for the beginning of the war at least, to have night games in New York City because they were afraid the U-boats could see, things that were silhouetted by the lights. They could see shipping and all that kind of thing in New York Harbor. So they had to shut that down and play during the day.
That was Ebbets Field because Yankee Stadium didn't even have
I'm sorry. Yeah. It was in New York, and also Ebbets Field, and also the Polo Grounds, I believe.
Yeah, they were closer to the water.
Closer to the water. Yeah. Yeah, so they couldn't play night games there. Thank you, David, for those two corrections. And so they couldn't play night games primarily because they were afraid of the U-boats being able to see the shipping come out. But I'm digressing a little. I'm just basically making the point that the main differences were the integration as a result of the Jackie Robinson signing, and then obviously in the American League, Cleveland, bringing in the first black player of the American League, and then of course all the way through Boston being the last with Pumpsie Green. So that's one of the two, and then the second is the night games being played more and more often, and then later TV, obviously, which changed the game in a tremendous way. But we touch on, but
yeah, and the Senators in particular, though, seem to just stumble their way through for the next 15 years to the point of
they were terrible. Yeah.
You think that that after all of that, and having survived the war and through the wiliness of the old fox of Clark Griffith, and integration, frankly, right, having some of the arguably some of the best Negro League players not only come through Griffith Stadium during that time, but also literally on the Grays themselves, that they would have somehow figured out a way to, shall we say, better themselves on the field, but it never really happened, now did it?
No. And David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Nationals were among the last teams to integrate, were they not?
Yes, they were. And of course, the interesting thing about, as Josh mentioned, the Red Sox being the last to integrate, the Red Sox actually, as Josh alluded to, the Red Sox actually gave Jackie Robinson one of these faux tryouts early on. They sent him and two other Negro League players up to Boston because there was some political activity going on in Boston and that they wanted to quash, and so they invited these 3 ball players up, and there was no one there of real who was really involved with the player personnel on the team. There was a couple of minor officials on the Red Sox, and they never even sent them. They never even acknowledged it afterwards. There was no follow-up note, thank you very much, but nothing like that happened. So, I know one area that we did forget to talk about in terms of the Negro Leagues and their ability to sustain themselves, it was when the Negro Leagues brought in a spokesperson for the team, for the leagues, who was going to be the front man on the team, on the leagues, to help integrate the sport. And unfortunately, Josh, help me out.
I'm blanking on who that would be.
He was Paul Robeson.
Oh, Paul Robeson. Yeah. He was a communist, was he not?
That was the problem.
Kind of a problem. Yeah.
That was the problem. They picked a socialist / communist, outspoken, very fine opera singer, to be the front man on it, and of course. Most Americans just turned their back on it. That was a disastrous decision. Even though he was well known to the American public, he was not the right person to pick to lead integration movement.
So let's again your current thoughts then about baseball, because obviously there was a long dry spell once the second version of the Senators left town, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts about sort of the current iteration of Washington's baseball franchise via the Nationals. It seems to me that there's been quite a bit of effort to remember some of the major sort of events in Washington D.C.'s baseball history by the Nationals. I would argue it's been more of an embrace, I guess, than perhaps some other sports and other teams tend to look back on their previous legacies. Right? It's weird, right? We said this with our conversation with Fred Frommer a number of weeks back, that in many respects the history of Washington baseball is somewhat transitory or not. It is ironically deeply rooted, but yet not so when you look at sort of the relatively peripatetic nature of the teams that have come and gone, right? And even today's version of the Nationals, right, is itself the former Montreal Expos, right? But it does seem like there's been an effort, and correct me if I'm wrong, to remember and embrace this very deep and interesting history of baseball in the Washington, D.C. area.
Yeah, you're correct up to a point. I have a big bone to pick with the current ownership of the team. When I went down to Orlando to do the research at Tinker Field, which was now just a good-looking baseball diamond, but it wasn't being used for that very much. But in front of the main gates, there was a statue and a bronze plaque. It was a large rectangular with a statue with a baseball on top, and this plaque dedicated to Clark Griffith and detailing his life in baseball. And I took some photographs of that. And at the time they were planning, the city of Orlando didn't know what to do with it. It abutted the Citrus Bowl, and they were going to knock it down because they needed more parking facility. And I went to a couple of people here in D.C. who had ins with the new ownership at the time, and because there were some things in the stadium that do reflect the original team and its players, but I said, let's bring the plaque to Washington, install it in the stadium, and no one was interested in doing it. And in the book, there is the plaque. One of the pictures I took of it is in the actually my son, so it was in the book. And sadly, I kept in contact with a writer on the Orlando Sentinel who was following the city's efforts to do whatever they were going to do with it. And sadly, the plaque was stolen and never recovered. And I think that was a loss to the new National Stadium, because I really think that would have been something they would have wanted to have if they really thought about it. And they've never recovered it. I'm sure it was melted down at some point. So, I even offered to just take the photo and blow it up, because there's a lot of photos on the walls down there of various aspects of the Washington franchise. I think what hurt was not only the fact that they had a crummy team in the 50s, but they had this sort of faux team. They became an expansion team, and then the expansion team moved away to Minneapolis a few years later. And for 30-some-odd years, there was no baseball in Washington.
You mean to the Rangers? You said the expansion team moved. Didn't the expansion team become the Rangers?
That's right. And then the next day, then they had another team.
Yeah.
And they lasted from the
first. Yeah, the first was the Minnesota, and then the second. Yeah.
Right.
Clark Griffith's nephew moved them to Minnesota. Yeah. And then they.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then as a result of that, Washington became the town that other owners used to threaten their populace when they wanted a new stadium, when they wanted more money for more revenue. Well, we can always move to Washington because there was.
I believe the White Sox pulled that 1 year.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of them tried that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So there was no rush. There was no rush.
Yeah, 30 some odd years without a team. So I will say, I will add to David's point. We did a book signing, and the Lerner family was kind enough to host us at the stadium.
Yes.
And I noticed a lot of baseball history that they paid very good attention to, considering it was the former Montreal Expos. They had many players on pictures, the streamers, whatever you want to call them, flags of different players from the past, including players from the Grays and players from the old Nats. They paid. I think they paid. Aside from the plaque and the things of those nature, I think they paid a good amount of attention to their history and to the Washington baseball history, because again, it is kind of convoluted. I mean, here it is. You have the original Nationals, the Griffith Nationals, going to Minneapolis when his nephew moves them, and then you have this kind of convoluted expansion team that's there later, and then I believe it's in '71 they moved to Texas, Dallas
right.
area, Arlington. So Washington was kind of this baseball desert for a long time, as David said, and teams still do this, as we know, where they threaten to move to different cities. In the NFL, it was Los Angeles for many years before they got two teams now, where they would threaten to do whatever it was to move there if they didn't get a new stadium. It's a very common practice. Matter of fact, in law school, I wrote about this and did a paper on this about how teams hold cities hostage of where they are in order to move, in order to threaten to move, in order to get a better stadium. And now we're seeing stadiums built almost every 20 years when they used to be every 50 years, things of that nature. I mean, Atlanta's a good example. They had a new stadium in '96, and then they moved, to their new stadium a couple of years ago. And then their football team did the same thing. So there's a lot of that. But D.C. in general was used all the time for that purpose, and a few other cities as well. I mean, I know Charlotte was mentioned a few times as expansion, things like that. But I think the family itself, considering how convoluted, I keep saying the word, but it is, it's really odd how there's this kind of all these different teams kind of floating in and out of D.C., they've done a pretty good job of being true to the history of it, considering that they came from Montreal. So they've also included those players as well.
Yes, that's true. And they use the stats.
They have to use this Montreal Expo stats, sort of like the Cleveland Browns had the right to keep their colors and their team when the Ravens went to Baltimore. So they they got to keep all the stats. For the franchise that was promised to them, that I believe was in Cleveland and put there in '99 as part of the deal when Cleveland allowed Art Modell to move to Baltimore. But I think they've done a pretty good job of that, and I think there's interest. They played many games in when they do the old Negro League throwbacks on games during the season. They'll play in Grays uniforms. And that kind of thing. So I think they try to be true to their history, but it's a pretty hard history, much more difficult to follow for the average fan than a lot of other places where they've had one team for a longer period of time, even though there's been a lot of movement. I mean, for example, the St. Louis Browns moving to Baltimore, but you still have teams like the St. Louis Cardinals who've been there forever. So I think they've done a good job of paying tribute to their history overall.
Yeah, and I think it's a unique opportunity, right? Given the status of Washington, obviously it's the nation's capital, and the national pastime, at least officially known as the national pastime. Although the Super Bowl and the NFL certainly seem to challenge that notion. All right, so here's your chance, guys, to promote the book. So give us the title and where we can find it, and then do you guys see yourselves doing any other projects around baseball or sports going forward, or is this pretty much the opus of your life's journey?
Well, the formal title is The Nats and the Grays, How Baseball in the Nation's Capital Survived World War II and Changed the Game Forever. Of course, it's just popularly known as The Nats and the Grays. It's published by Rowman and Littlefield Publishers. They're over in Lanham, Maryland. The book is available in hardcover or paperback now. The paperback came out, I think, just before the start of the baseball season.
2017.
Yeah, right, 2017, and it actually, we have a tribute to the 70th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's Major League debut, because as Josh says, it came out in 2017. As opposed to 1947. So it is available. You can get it at any bookstore, and I'm very partial to it. I think we did as good a job as we possibly could. We've never gotten anyone writing to us saying, "Oh, you got this wrong." Thanks to Josh, we've never had anybody coming to us and saying, "You got this wrong" or something.
All right, more interestingness as we do each and every week. Thank you to Josh Drazen and to David Hubler. And again, the book is called The Nats and the Grays, How Baseball in the Nation's Capital Survived World War II and Changed the Game Forever. It is published by Rowman and Littlefield. You will find a link to that book and all its various versions, hardcover or softcover or even the Kindle version, on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up the episode with Messrs. Hubler and Drazen, and you will find a description of the show, but also a link to the book. And by buying that book through that link, you will give us a few shekels by doing so. And of course, that helps keep our lights on and our water flowing and all kinds of other good stuff that so we can keep the show up and running for you each and every week. Let's see, on goodseatsstillavailable.com is also the place to find all of our various social media links. You'll find us on Twitter at goodseatsstill. You'll find us on Instagram at goodseatsstillavailable. There is a Facebook page devoted to this show, if you can believe that or not. As well, you can find our email link on our website, but that's also, you can do that directly at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll also find a link on our website to subscribe to our little weekly newsletter. We put out a little notification each and every week about what the episode's going to be and some cool imagery and a couple of other little factoids that come along with that each and every week. So we appreciate you doing that. And of course, please, rate and review this silly little show, will you? Just wherever you can do that, Apple iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Google Play, wherever you listen, Spotify or Spreaker or on Stitcher, if you listen to us on iHeartRadio, or you download us on your favorite little podcast app like oh God, there's just so many of them out there, right? Just by all means, rate and review us, and hopefully positively. We appreciate you doing that because that helps our algorithm and it helps people find us. And we certainly could benefit from more audience and more people like you who love this show to spread that love even further. And we thank you for doing that. We thank Jerry Payne, our friend at Podfly Productions, for helping us with our editorial and production needs. And if you need some help, either getting going in your own podcasting or where you think you've got it figured out and you want to go to the next level, well, by all means, check out Podfly Productions, and you can find them at podfly.net. All right, we're done for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Until next week, God knows what we're going to have for you then, but hopefully you'll keep our feed open and you'll look for that next episode, and we can't wait to share it with you. Until then, take care.